You need to hear this today. In a society that has lost track of the value structure that made it great, Jordan Peterson is a reminder of what exactly lies at the root of it, and here's the truth. Not a lot of people today are willing to accept it's that those values are nestled into a religious substructure that pressed on us even today, and you don't even need to be religious to recognize that. Because I think the way Jordan just explained the value of sacrifice has so many parallels that we can draw to a more secular and evolutionary reading of human history, and perhaps that's only a testament to its accuracy. So subscribe to the channel and watch this next clip before we get into it.
And the idea that sacrifice is the basis of the community, that's just obvious. Like the fact that you're married. So what's the sacrificial gesture there? Well, all other women. That's sacrifice number one. Then it's not about you. It's also not about your wife. It's about the stability of your union across time. And it's about the stability of that union insofar as that's a reliable foundation for your children. So that's sacrificial too. You give up your whims in the present so that the future's stabilized. You give up your immaturity so that your children can thrive. That's all sacrificial gesture. And we figured that out. That's why we put the crucifix at the center of our society. Because we figured out, even though we didn't know it, we figured out that the stability of the community is predicated on the willingness of the individual to sacrifice. And the exploration in the New Testament is the limits of sacrifice.
I believe that conception of sacrifice has an overlap with our biological imperatives for survival, which is perhaps why Jordan Peterson has been so hesitant to disregard religious stories on a purely rational basis. Religious stories like that of Jesus on the cross are an abstraction, and an abstraction is not the same as a fiction. If you take someone like Richard Dawkins, whose opposition to religion is only matched by his reverence for evolutionary biology, you'll find the same idea of sacrifice at the root of his reading of human history. In that sense, both Dawkins and Peterson can be taken as moving forward in the same thing, but from different directions. If you've read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, you realize that what he's really speaking about is how selfish genes result in altruistic animals, where bonds of kin, family, community, and trust are built through sacrifice of immediate personal whims toward a more collective goal of survival. Delayed gratification lies at the root of human society, and that's evidenced by the fact that any one individual member of society that acts in absolute self-interest quickly finds himself excluded and isolated. That's what sociopaths are by definition, because they don't understand the spirit of sacrifice. And I think what Jordan Peterson really wants modern society to understand is that the importance of sacrifice is very difficult to pass on to generations unless it is nestled in a story. And that inevitably risks diluting it across time until society gives rise to individuals that are more too much towards selfishness on the spectrum of sacrifice, because there's no secular story we've built that as potent and actionable as the Christian story.
I don't think it's ever been explained to me that way. And I don't think most people think about it that way. When they think about it, they think Jesus died for our sins. There he is. Praise Jesus.
Right.
It's a very
formulaic,
surface level understanding.
Well, I think
of what
it's
it is
partly
we're talking
because
about.
it's partly, and there's a merciful element of it. And this is what Jung was referring to when he said that religion helps protect people against religious experience. The full revelation of the significance, let's say, of the imitation of Christ, which is supposed to be the foundation of Christian belief, is in fact the demand that you walk the same pathway. And that's it's the most terrifying demand, because so Jung described the Christian passion as an archetypal tragedy. Now, there was a reason for that. So you think about it this way, think about it technically. So imagine that 100 great storytellers told the most painful possible story. And then imagine that you aggregated all those stories and you distilled them into one story where all the terrible elements were present. Okay, so now you have a representation of the worst life can throw at you. Okay, so let's take that apart a bit. So the first thing that makes a tragedy tragic is that the tragedy befalls a good person. Because if a tragedy befalls a villain, it's just justice. It's not a tragedy. So it has to be a good person. So then to amplify that, you would not only have the tragedy befall a good person, you'd have it befall a good person that everyone knew was good, but was not only good, was the best, and that was persecuted because he was good. So that sort of limits it out in that direction. And then you might say, well, what does he have to face? Well, and the answer would be, the worst life has to offer.
And you know what that does? That fundamentally Christian story helps make your individual sacrifice pale in comparison, and that's exactly what has made it last as long as it has. It tells you that as bad as you may have it in life, there's someone that has faced worse in life and still had courage and faith to persist. The story of Jesus on the cross as a metaphorical truth acts like a bulwark against making you bitter from the problems of your life. Because think about it. Life is ultimately full of pain and suffering. That is the truth that even the Buddhist tradition in the East Society has found. And in a society like ours, it's extremely easy to feel like you're especially victimized and oppressed, which is exactly the vocabulary you hear from the modern left. Perhaps we're in the midst of finding out what happens when the intellectual bulwark is removed and the psyche is allowed to fall into the abyss of its own self-victimhood until it becomes vengeful and angry. Isn't that what you find in modern culture? Well, you got people divided into oppressors and oppressed on an intersectional plane, and a certain segment of privileged oppressors on racial and gender lines made the scapegoat for all ills and wrongs in society. That's where terms like patriarchy and white privilege come from, ultimately from a resentful reading of history and human relations. That's something Jordan Peterson has been warning about all along.
Early death, early painful death, early painful, humiliating, unjust death at the hands of his friends, at the hands of the mob, under the thumb of a tyrant. Right. Brought about by people who knew that he was not only good, but the best of men. That's an archetypal tragedy. And then it doesn't limit out. So then you have the death that occurs in consequence of that, and it's voluntary acceptance. But that's not where it ends, because the mythology surrounding the crucifixion story insists that Christ harrowed hell after the crucifixion, which meant that he confronted not only death, but malevolence itself, and in consequence transcended both. And so what's the underlying psychological message? It's something like the calling and the voice of conscience informing people that in order to thrive properly in life and to become who you could be, if you could be everything you could be, you have to voluntarily take on the weight of the worst life has to offer, including the depths of malevolence itself.
Here's what's at the heart of our failure to recognize that. It's that we as a society have developed an incredibly myopic view of history. We think history began 200 years ago when values of rationalism and the Enlightenment spread across the world and obscured the kind of society that existed before it. While it may be easy for people in the 21st century to scoff at societies for believing in religious stories and think that we've grown too smart and rational for them, the truth is more complicated. Religious stories aren't simply the opium of the masses, as Marx put it, or the defense against fear of mortality, as Sigmund Freud would tell you. It's a structure that holds a set of values that past societies have used to communicate from vital truths and propagate them through generations. And one of the most cardinal truths is the necessity of sacrifice that Jordan Peterson doesn't want modern society to forget at its own peril.